Okay, we'll continue with Diana Larsen and 5 rules setting the conditions for learning in software teams. Thank you.
Yeah. I expected half of the chairs to be empty. So during that break, did you have a chance to switch from your German-speaking brain into your English-speaking brain? I am very grateful that we aren't going to try to stumble through this in my German, which is largely nouns. Tisch. Yeah, right? Arbeit, so. Arbeit, yeah. So thank you for doing that. I know that that's not always the easiest thing to do, to make that switch. So I very much appreciate it. So we're here to talk about the conditions for learning, and so maybe we'll wrap that back in a bit. Software development and much of the work that gets done around software development is what the management scientists call knowledge work, right? Have you heard that term, knowledge work? Knowledge work largely is learning work. Now, I've had a conversation with another coach, Tim Ottinger, and he says that he thinks software development is making decisions. And so we have a nice little conversation about, where I say, but how can you make decisions if you haven't learned anything about what's going on first, right? So I agree with him, decision making is important. You're constantly making choices when you're programming, when you're thinking about tests, when you're writing stories for a backlog. All of that is knowledge work. All of that is learning work. And it leads to some making good decisions, we hope. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, the way I think about this is that when we think about setting the conditions for learning, we can think about it in a number of ways. So we can think about it for my own learning. I to some extent, am an autodidact, right? I teach myself. I go and I seek out things that I want to learn, and I find ways to get practice or learn knowledge about that. And so that's me teaching me, my own learning. I can set the conditions so that that happens well or with difficulty, right? Some of us are in roles where we are helping other people learn. We are coaches, we are trainers, we are facilitators. Working with in a meeting to help a meeting run well is setting conditions for people to learn what they need to learn in that meeting to go off and do what they need to do after the meeting, whatever the decisions are. So that's important too. Coaching and mentoring is helping people learn about their own work and what path they want their work to go on and how they work together with others, right? So that is there, and technical coaching as well. Any time you're in a work environment where learning is key, these 5 rules that we're going to talk about apply there. So it's important to think about and have in mind for yourself some instance of learning. Now, you could pick your own learning. You could pick some learning that you are trying to help other people with, either at classroom or at work. So take a moment and get in mind some learning situation that you are involved in or have been involved with recently for yourself or for others. And when you have that in mind, just raise your hand. So as we go through the rest of these slides, I want you to match that situation with what we'll be talking about. Okay? Anytime you want to set the conditions for learning, these 5 rules will be helpful to you. And they are. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and then we're going to go through them in more depth. Keep it alive. Do it for real. Setting first. Start obvious, stay obvious. And focus on flow. Those are the 5 rules. Simple. There, now you can all just go. You've got that. So no. We'll go into a little more depth. So for each of these 5 rules, I'm going to talk about the rule a little bit, what it means. I'm also going to talk about the metric that I use, how I think about the rule, and the questions I ask myself when I'm setting the conditions for learning, right? So keep it alive. Keep it alive honors and recognizes the fact that when we are learning, unless you're training dogs, in which case, yeah, I guess you'd have to figure out what keeps them alive. But for the most part, we are working with humans. And the minute we forget that in setting the conditions for learning, very little learning happens, right? So we want to think about what is this spark of aliveness. A gesture that a friend of mine uses is this. It's like something growing in your heart. What is it that makes people feel alive when they are learning? Who has an idea? Connection to other people, making a connection, yeah. Excitement, yeah. Anytime you can sort of heighten emotions a bit, whether it's laughing or crying, both help learning happen, right? What else? Pardon? Intrinsic motivation. If you can understand what really gives people juice, right? That helps. Pardon? Happiness. Yeah, it's another positive emotion. Play. We hear a lot about gamifying things these days, and to the extent that that's playful, it works. When it becomes gamified drudgery, not so much learning happens, and I've experienced both. I suspect you have too. Appealing to our senses, color, right? Smells, music, songs. There's a reason there was music here in between, right? That helps, it engages people, it helps people feel alive. Having the networking before the session gave the opportunity for those personal connections, right? So there are lots of ways that we can think about how do people feel most alive? And that's part of the condition for learning. That actually is the absolute basic one. If we don't do anything else, this is the one that we have to value the most. Understand that when I am managing my own learning, I have to treat myself well, right? I have to recognize that I'm human, that staying up for 3 days in a row reading books is not going to help me learn, right? Because I'm not taking care of my human needs. Making sure that people have an opportunity for rest, that they are well hydrated, that they have wonderful food. It's been a marvelous experience for me yesterday and today, just walking around this office, noticing all the examples of aliveness that are here. Yes, it's back there. Yeah. So, things like texture, right? Isn't that an amazing wall? Right? I mean, think if that was just a big, flat, white, concrete, yeah. But there's wood there. There's texture there. It's soft, right? So anything that helps to keep it alive, anything that helps that happen fits this. And what that does is it gains energy for the learning. The reason that we focus on keep it alive is that's what fosters energy for learning. So the keep it alive dial, this is a metric. We think of these as the human metrics, right? How are we thinking about the humans? And what we watch for to do this metric, to take this measure, is body language. Are people leaning forward? Are they, they have a drink in their hand? They, what's the facial expressions that are going on? Is there an emotional quality? I don't know how many of you have seen the video of a keynote address that I gave at the Agile conference. Anybody here seen that? Yeah. One of the things I talk in there about is a guy named Benjamin Zander, right? Who talks about when you are working with people, when you want people to learn, you want to see shiny eyes. Right? People leaning forward with shiny eyes. That's an indicator that they are alive, right? How are they engaged? How are they self-organizing? All of those kinds of things, right? What's the quality of that? So we make a little continuum here, a slider. Think of that as a slider. And on one end is no eye contact. People seem bored. People are disengaged. They may be falling asleep. It's late. Way back there, if you doze off, right? So, or are their eyes wide open? Are they laughing? Are they crying? Are they emotionally engaged? Is it playful? Do you see that leaning forward with shiny eyes that really shows you full engagement, right? So, when I am in a situation, when I am trying to help people learn, I ask myself the question, what could I do here to increase the aliveness, right? So for me, one thing is to get down off of the stage and come down here and be with you, right? Why all that distance there, right? Can you still see me? I'm really standing. I'm not sitting right now. Right? So how can I say something amusing and everybody laughs? How can I increase the aliveness here? If we had a little more time, you would all be sitting in small circles. You would not be sitting in rows like this, right? So that question is always on my mind. How can I make it more alive here? This is a very alive place, but what could happen here to make it even more alive? Who has an idea? Music we could dance. We could still dance. We could still, after, yeah. Yeah, the two of us could dance. Yeah. Engaging the audience. Yes, absolutely. And is Corinna still here? Where's Corinna? Yeah. One of the best things for aliveness is when we understand our place in the generations. So it's wonderful to have a baby here. It's wonderful. And actually there's been some research done that if in a situation where you want people to be learning, if you just have indicators of the presence of children, you don't actually have to have the real children there, but if you have indicators of them, crayons, toys, baby blankets, I don't know, whatever, that it fosters people's learning. If you have some indicator of the presence of elders, so that people have that sense of generations, that taps into our humanness, right? So the second rule is do it for real. And do it for real is to expand fluent capability and capacity in your group. There's a very big difference between learning for doing something, learning for application, learning to actually be able to build your mastery, and learning about a thing, right? And the best is praxis. The best is both together, right? But when it's one or the other, what we want to do is give people the opportunity to practice what they're learning. So when I ask you, how could we make it more alive here? That's an opportunity for you to think about your learning situation and how could I make that situation more alive for me? Do I need to have the coffee pot closer? Right? What needs to happen so that I would be more alive? So fluency is about how we become fluently proficient. That's the praxis. Proficiency is the knowing about a thing. Fluency is about practicing it. Just like in language. We can study linguistics, right? And we can learn about how languages are constructed, but that doesn't help us when we want to be in conversation, right? We have to actually practice the language. We have to actually speak with someone. We have to be in conversation. Memorizing lists of verbs isn't going to get me there, right? I have to be able to have that conversation to get good at a language. And the same is true here. For real fluent proficiency, we have to be able to practice it. We have to do it for real. We need to, and a lot of language programs now have, conversation partners, right? Because you have to be able to practice it. Fluency is about how we perform habitually. Not something we can stretch into once in a while if we really have time to prepare and think about it, right? That's not fluency yet. If you keep practicing, you may get fluent, but it's not there yet, right? And it's habitual, routine, skillful, fluent ease, or skillful, smooth ease is when we are fluent. Of course, fluent comes from the same root as flow, right? Influence. There's a fun one, right? How do we flow in with someone else and help them, move them in a direction? So learning to build fluency is about this opportunity to practice, to actually do a thing so that we get to that routine ease where it's the first thing we do. Now, tomorrow I'm going to be doing a workshop with some folks about a model that Jim Shore and I put together called Agile Fluency. And it's about teams. It's how are teams doing in Agile, in their practices, in their outcomes. How are their organizations supporting them? And what we've learned is that just like with language, we become fluent in Agile kind of a step at a time. We don't get it all at once. Just like we don't get a language all at once. First I learn a few nouns, Tisch and Arbeit, right? And then I learn to put them together in sentences, simple sentences, in the present tense, questions and answers. And then I can put those sentences together in paragraphs. And I can begin to tell a story because now I can do past tense, present tense, future tense, right? Maybe future conditional or something, right? Right? And then I get to the place where I can put those paragraphs, those stories together to give a speech or participate in a debate. think about things in an abstract, talk about things in an abstract kind of way. Begin to dream, right? Same thing with any skill that we learn. We gain fluency in a progression because we practice it. And as we practice it, we can gain more and more fluency till we get to the place where it's enough, right? Would be a very sad thing if I came here and I couldn't get around the town, right? Luckily, I have friends, right? So my needful level of fluency here is pretty low. Novice will do me here, right? My lists of nouns will get me by, right? All right. So doing it for real is about building this fluent capacity. So the dial here is skill building. How are we doing at getting better at the thing we want to learn? So we watch for, are we actually doing it? Are we practicing with our backlog? Do we look at it over and over again? Do we see if we've moved things up or down? Right? Are we paying attention? Are we looking for our capacity and our capabilities to grow? How do we tell when that's happening? So, low fluency. In situations of low fluency, what we see are people sort of waiting around for the learning to start. Right? Right? And waiting around to be able to do the thing. I'm just, a lot of times we'll have overviews and introductions and exposure to. And those are great because they give us a framework. They give us a way to figure out how we're going to hang the ideas in our heads when we actually get them. But if that goes on too long, there's no learning happening. There's no real learning happening. When we hear questions that are kind of edge cases or objections, or, well, what if the volcano blew and, the cloud came over and we weren't able to connect up to the server and right. You start, when people aren't actually doing it for real, you get more of those kinds of questions, right? Whether it's in a work situation or in a classroom situation or in a person, when you find yourself for your own learning beginning to daydream about the very weird edge cases and so on. But I shouldn't really be studying this because, what if all of our customers decided tomorrow to go somewhere else? Then I wouldn't really be needing to do this at all, right? Right. So that's low. That's when there's low fluency. It's low doing it for real. And when there is high, people have that fully embodied experience. And actually, like if you think in courses, in training courses, simulations are somewhere in here, right? They're not down there. They're much more engaging than that. But they aren't really quite doing it for real, right? But you can get a little way along, and you can make some progress with things that simulate the thing that you really want to be able to do, right? It's a way of practicing. When performing is its own justification. About a year ago, we got a piano. I have wanted to have a piano in our house for a very long time. And we finally got a piano. It's one of my bucket, do you know the term bucket list? Like stuff you want to do before you die, right? Well, on my bucket list is learning to play the piano. I thought if there was a piano in my house, I would have a better chance, but go figure. So, but my 11-year-old grandson that I live with lives with me. We all lived together in a big house. He wanted to learn to play the piano too. He's been drumming for a while, and he wanted to learn to play the piano. And so he is now, a year later, playing, he's long since. He started out with the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, and he now, because it was around last Christmas, and now he's through the year, he's gone through Moonlight Sonata and For Elise and a couple of other things. Most recently, he was practicing the pop song Monsters. Have you heard that one? And now he started Bohemian Rhapsody. And he just sits down and does it. Performing is its own justification. He wants to hear what the piano sounds like, and it's always there. It's always available to him, right? That's the aliveness piece, right? So he can just sit down and he just works it out. He found an app on the iPad that will show him where his fingers should go, and over the course of the year, he has done these amazing things. Now, he's not yet at the place where he can read music, but I have a feeling that when he wants to read music, when he wants to be able to pick up a sheet of music, that's going to come very easy to him, because he's already going to know what it feels like to play, right? Performing is its own justification. It's been an amazing thing to watch, I have to say. So, always we are asking ourselves here, the question is, how can I move closer to doing this for real? How can I get closer to doing this for real? So, if what we're doing now is holding a space where each of you can have the opportunity to practice these 5 rules, how do we move closer to doing it for real? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a real question. How do we move closer to doing it for real? Just do it. Yeah. One of the things I asked you was have something in mind that you can compare this to, because I wanted you to be able to think through those situations for your own learning, right? What else? What else could we do to do this for real? Pardon? Set a schedule, right? Back here? Oh, you're so smart. Yeah. Yes, right? So always putting it back, giving it back to you, having you have the opportunity to engage in these questions helps you to do it for real, right? Yeah. Seeing a purpose, right. Yes, absolutely. It's without knowing why, and this is part of the aliveness, it's part of the engagement. Without knowing why, it's very hard to feel like you want to spend the time to do it for real, right? So you have to find that for yourself, and you have to be able to, we were talking about how do you help people find their own motivation, right? That's key here. So what is it? And so what I asked you was, what's a thing you want to learn, or a thing you want to help someone learn, right? Because if you don't have a purpose for it, it doesn't mean anything. Oops, let's go back. So, the foundation to everything is keep it alive. Absolutely. We've got to acknowledge our humanness. How many here have ever read Christopher Alexander? The Nature of Order, Pattern Language, Timeless Way of Building. Any of those? Okay. He has a concept that he used to call quality without a name. And it really is that ineffable beauty of keeping it alive, right? Noticing what is driving things toward being more alive and what is driving things to being more dead. And he says in any situation you can look at two things and say this one is more alive and this one is less alive, right? So, so that's the foundation. Then after that is we want people to, in order to feel satisfaction in the learning, in order to feel confident, you have to have that practice. You have to be able to do it for real, right? So those are the first two that we talk about. But the third one is setting. Setting first. Anytime we are getting ready to be in that learning situation, we need to pay attention to how have we set things up to do that. For the workshop that I'm going to do tomorrow, first thing I wanted to do was see the room. What does this room look like? How can I move things around? What do we need to have in here so that people can have the best opportunity for learning, right? The setting is extraordinarily important, right? Because it is the thing that supports all the other learning. So this is how well is this physical environment, and to some extent the psychological environment, but usually starting with the physical environment first. How is this physical environment underpinning the other four rules? How is it making it more alive? How is it making it easier to do it for real? And then the other two that we're going to talk about. So always thinking about that. So what I look for is to avoid poor settings inhibit aliveness or fluency or signal or focus, the other things that we're going to talk about. And it creates a barrier to learning. Why make it harder? A setting can make it so much harder for people to learn, right? A rich setting, the kind of setting that we want, reinforces those other rules, makes them more present, and really helps to drive the learning. It's not passive at all. It's a very active thing to have the right setting. So the question here is, how do I adapt this setting? How do I influence this setting? How do I move things around? So how would we improve this setting? Both the one you have in mind and this one right here. How could we improve this setting to make it, so far we've talked about aliveness and do it for real. So let's just focus on those two. How could we improve this setting for that? Yeah. Get rid of all the chairs. You know, there was amazing networking going over here when people could just sort of mill around and connect with each other however they wanted to a little while ago, right? There was an interesting buzz. And I could use my ears to tell that there was aliveness, right? What else might we do? What would we do? What would we do instead of having the chairs? Would we just have everybody stand up for 45 minutes? Would that work? For 10? Okay. Yeah. Right? Yeah. We could rearrange the chairs so that people could stand up for a while and then sit down, stand up for a while and sit down. Yeah. There's a reason for the length of a daily stand-up meeting. Right? It's an aliveness issue. The minute you start seeing, the minute you start seeing daily stand-ups starting to go like this, right? It's an aliveness issue. Right? Nobody's going to be learning anything. Right? What else? How else could we make this? How else could this setting make it easier to do it for real? Pardon? Sit in a half circle. Yeah? I don't know if we could actually configure that, but I would give it a try. Right? Switch off the lights upstairs. Oh. Could you? Yeah. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, continuous improvement, right. And that is really setting first, is that idea. I mean, all of these questions are about continuous improvement. How do we keep setting the conditions better and better and better and better so that people can learn, including ourselves? All right. Ah, nice, yeah. Thank you, whoever made that suggestion. That's great. So the fourth rule is start obvious, stay obvious. I have this really big issue with trainers who will introduce a topic and they'll do something elaborate, which I won't do right now. And then they will say, now that's an example of how not to do it. It's like, what? Maybe that's not as common now as it used to be, but that used to happen a lot. Or professors who, give you trick questions instead of straightforward ones, right? I mean, life is hard enough, right? So start obvious, stay obvious helps to keep the action moving. It helps to get the momentum rolling, get over the initial inertia to learning that we all have. You sit down, put your paper in front of you and your pencil here. No, I need coffee. Right? Go back and get coffee. It can sometimes be hard to kind of get yourself going. So the more obvious it is, the more obvious the next thing is, the better. So we start out obvious and then we keep it obvious. What's an example of keeping things obvious in an Agile team room? Whiteboards, what? Do what you say, yeah. Public backlog, big visible charts, keeping things very transparent, making the work visible, right? The definition of done helps very much, right? Yes. The whole idea about start obvious, stay obvious is we want the right signal to noise ratio. We want the signal high and the noise low, right? Because people learn best in those conditions. So we don't want any friction in the way. We want to eliminate any time somebody is hesitating. That tells us, it's not obvious enough. If it's confusing, ambiguous, unclear, what do we need? How do we make it clearer, right? So we know we've got a lot of noise, a lot of static in our signal if we're getting questions about safety or, concerns about how precise should this be as opposed to just doing it. Anything that's distracting and confusing, those things. And when the signal is high, we see people doing things and regularly getting those moments, right? Oh, now I understand, right? Their attention is fully engaged with the learning. They are spontaneously innovating new ways to do a thing. Confidence is building, trust is building. Those bottom two bullets are confidence and trust. It's not obvious enough, right? I see someone who's straining to see here, which tells me, to really be obvious, that needs to be up. This should be up another, about here for this room, right? So all of this, all of these dials, all of these rules mean that we have to really be paying attention. As the person who is learning, I need to be paying attention to my own experience so that I can adjust the conditions for me, or I can request that the conditions be adjusted, just like the lights, right? And if I'm trying to help other folks learn, I have to be constantly paying attention to what's getting in their way. How are they doing? What do they need? Right. So, how can I boost the signal and make it more obvious? This one actually has two questions. How do I make it more obvious? And how do I add clarity and remove all these distractions, remove this static from my signal? Right? So I'm thinking about those things all the time. Where is the confusion in this room, and how could we remove it? Yes? Pardon? Oh, the fans. Yeah, the fans are distracting. I can't tell you how many training rooms I go into and I end up having to turn off fans. Yeah. And open windows. Yeah. Right. What else? What else is causing confusion or distraction? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if we'll be able to accomplish that right now, but yes, that I would, if I could, I would try to do that. Yeah. 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 Yeah, acoustics. Acoustics are often an issue, more often than we think. I am always amused by speakers who will come up in front of a room and they look at a microphone and they go, oh, I don't want to use a microphone. Can you hear me in the back? Everybody will say, yeah. Okay, now we're going to start talking like this. Now I'm going to talk in my normal voice, right, after I've shouted in the back. Right? It's important to make sure that everyone can hear. Right? I had a little reluctance to put on this microphone, and then somebody said, oh, the acoustics back there. I said, oh, okay. So the last rule is focus on flow. And this really is about that proficiency part, right? This is about how do we learn what we learn? How do we become more knowledgeable? And that is about focus on flow. This is, in what way am I going to present the information or the experience of practice, or how am I going to go find myself, what's the right sequence for that? What thing do I need to learn first and second and third that's going to make, that it's going to accumulate and build for me? Right? So we talk about arranging the learning in bite-sized pieces. This is a little bit like writing similar-sized stories and slicing them thinly, right? Right? We want it to be, we want the learning, the pieces of learning that we are going to attempt, we want them to be small enough to easily consume, but big enough to be interesting. Right? So there's a balance point there. Small enough to be easy to do the next thing and kind of add that in for learning to juggle. How do I make it small enough to add in that next ball, right? So now I'm up to go to 2 to 3. I don't go from 2 balls to 6 balls, right? Into 1, 2, 3, right? And I just do this for a little while. How many of you have ever learned to juggle? You just do this for a little while, a long time, and then you do this. Right? Right. And it has to be in a sequence that makes sense, that gives that interesting performance that we were talking about a little bit earlier. So there we constructed this little idea of a dial. It's like it has to be small enough that we're not panicked and overwhelmed by what we're getting, but big enough that we're not bored by it. And in the middle there is flow. And if you think about the flow of your work, that's where flow state is. That's where you get nice, steady throughput. Boredom or panic both create bottlenecks. right? So if you want the flow to continue, you want to find that just right place. So unfocused, too small, too big, things that are off topic, adding in something tangential just because. If you're really trying to facilitate somebody's learning, you don't want to do that. Or drowning them in detail. Oops. There. Okay. So the right focus is the largest bite that a learner can easily consume and still find interesting. And the way you know you've got that is people begin to ask questions about the very next bite you have planned. That's a wonderful thing when that happens. There's a story that we tell about how Jim Shore and I developed the Agile Fluency model, and it was because we were working, it's one of those yak shaving things where we did 6 other things and got there, but we were doing a workshop and we were talking about adaptive planning. And it was called The Art of Agile Planning, this workshop. And the first couple of times we presented it, we talked about vision and roadmap and release planning and iteration planning and daily stand-up, right? And, people said they liked the workshop. We got good evaluations, but a few people said, I didn't really get where we were going. I didn't understand, So then the next time we did the workshop, we did it the other way around. We started with user stories, and then we talked about daily stand-up, and then we talked about iteration planning, then we talked about release planning, and so on. And people said, oh, we liked the workshop, but I never really understood how things fit together. And what was the big picture of what we were trying to do? It's like, okay, so big picture down isn't working, and little picture up isn't working. What are we going to do? And that actually got us to thinking about Agile Fluency and what order to do things. Anyway, so we reordered the workshop along the idea of what's the right next bite-sized piece? What is the most easily consumable thing? And the really wonderful thing was when we had just finished a module and 3 hands went up and they were all asking questions about the very next module we had planned. And we said, yes, now we have it right. Now we have it right. Right? Because those questions come in. They're a great indicator. And we see people getting more mastery. We see people getting more knowledgeable. So the question here is, how do I better shape the size and sequence of the learning goals for myself or for others or for my organization, for that matter? I think it's all fractal. So for the learning situation that you have in mind, what's an idea you have about how you might better shape that, how you might choose a different sequence than what you're currently using? Yeah. Yeah. So understanding where people are starting from and giving some folks some extra help if they need a little more preparation, or yeah. Okay. What else? Yeah. Visualize everything. Yeah. That really, it helps people to see where they are in the progress. And that's why Jim and I did the Agile Fluency model, because we saw teams all over the place flailing around going, are we Agile or are we not Agile? And are you doing Agile or are you being Agile? And I mean, all that kind of stuff, right? And we said, wait, these aren't the right questions, right? It's about value and how do we think about that and so on. Yeah. So keep it alive, do it for real, setting first, start obvious, stay obvious, and focus on flow. And I actually have a PDF of this that I will give to Frida and the gang here, and so you can I don't know, you're just I looked over there and there you were. And so that if any of you want a copy of these slides, you can get them. So we've talked about keep it alive, we talked about do it for real, setting first, start obvious, stay obvious, and focus on the flow. And I now for about 2 or 3 years, these are and it's 5 things. So it fits this kind of handy mnemonic device that you have at the end of your arm, right? I haven't quite figured out an acronym yet, but anyway, keep it alive, do it for real, setting first, start obvious, stay obvious, focus on the flow. Right? 5 things to keep in mind. And over the past few years, I've discovered every time I go into a learning situation, whether it's for me or other people, if I keep those in mind, the learning accelerates. And it has to do with how we set up our workspaces. If we think a lot of learning needs to go on there, then we need to be keeping these in mind as we set up our workspaces, as we set up our own spaces for our work. Because software development is knowledge work, is learning work. So that can make the decisions that you need to make. So we actually have a book. It's on LeanPub. And it goes into more detail on all of these, along with some stories about where we've applied each of these rules. And here's I like to hear your stories of where you've applied the 5 rules and how that's worked for you. So please, here's a lot of ways to stay in touch with me. And thank you.